Energy trends of China and India. The QR code in the top corner directs you to subscribe the channel for free. We are live on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. X. It's a pleasure having Professor Cleveland Jones. Professor, good afternoon.
Nice to be with you again, Kavaya.
Thank you. This is Professor Cleveland Jones. Let me show some data about him. Only the first phrase. Professor Jones, international consultant in oil and gas. So you can stop video later and see more details about him. Okay, Professor Cleveland has some slides related to the China and India energy sector. Please, if you could start, Professor.
Yes, Kavanya. Like I said, I think it's important when we talk about energy trends. The big weight nowadays is still oil and gas. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the oil and gas situation for both countries. Um, Here, let me put this up. What's going on? Why isn't it going on? Here. Um, First, talking about India, in geological terms, and I'm sure some viewers might be looking at this situation. It's important to understand that the general situation for oil and gas prospectivity in India is not very favorable. Basically, there's two oil regions. Well, there's several, but there's only two that are significant oil and gas producers, and only two that have potential for maybe further discoveries and providing production for India. The Bay of Bengal, for example, which for a long time was in the eastern side, which was for a long time viewed as interesting because of the sediment accumulations and so on. But it's impossible. There's 20 kilometers of sediments accumulated. I mean, the oil and gas industry is still not ready for any plays that have that kind of situation. So, basically, we're looking at a situation where India is going to be constrained in its oil and gas aspirations. It has bidding rounds going on, but it's mostly some smaller stuff onshore, maybe small niche plays, offshore, like in these two regions, but nothing so far that I would consider major. So that's their situation. The same might be said for China because they also are a big country, of course, with lots of uh, uh, oil and gas basins, sedimentary basins onshore, but with very little prospectivity or potential other than for shale gas, which maybe is something that China is one of the few countries in the world that might try to develop shale gas, not to the extent that the U.S. has done, but could develop those resources. But I circled here the only region which I think has potential. It's an offshore region, small, the Bohai offshore play. Some discoveries have been made. Recently, China said that it discovered 1 billion barrels of potential resources. Maybe, but the region has potential. In the next 5 years, we could see something there. But you see, that is still too little for a country of the size, the population, and the economy of China. Um, and look at this. The fact that China and India are both gigantic oil importers and have a tremendous dependency on oil and gas. And China in oil from many sources, gas from Russia and other sources. India, the same. They're both benefiting maybe in the sense that they can buy cheaper oil and gas from Russia nowadays because of sanctions. They were doing so from Iran because of sanctions. But the basic fundamental problem is still there. They're heavily dependent on imports. And that is unfortunate. Furthermore, I want to show this also. If we go down and look at, some specific information, China oil production, not very great. 4 million barrels a day, 1/3. of what they need. India, same thing, very small oil production, under 1 million barrels a day. Their reserves are can be called significant, but even so, um, Chinese oil reserves are basically 18 years of consumption, but those reserves are not that easy to produce. Many of those are onshore with a lot of technical problems. India, like I pointed out, has small reserves, maybe similar reserves will last, 15, 20 years at most. They will probably make some discoveries, but the situation is not favorable because those reserves are not easily produced. The other aspect is not just the oil and gas situation, but the electricity production and consumption in the country, because the installed capacity in both of these countries is tremendous, basically because they have populations of over 1 billion people, 1.5, 1.4 billion people. So installed capacity of 3 terawatts is very impressive, but when you look at it, over 60% is from coal. Uh, India, the same situation, 70% from electricity production from coal. That is, you could say that is a benefit because coal is very cheap, and that is why they're stressing coal. But that is a problem. Even those countries recognize that it's not just climate change. They're looking at pollution effects. Maybe not so concerned about the eventual climate change effects. They're worried about pollution. The most polluted cities in the world are in China and India, where coal plants are spewing out giant pollution. So that is a problem for them. Overall,
Professor, let me interrupt you because
yeah,
you said something very important for our understanding. Because India probably is exporting oil products to the U.S. So the U.S. is banning is let's see forcing bans
yeah,
to Iran to Russia, and India is buying oil from Iran and Russia, processing this oil, making products, and exporting to the U.S. You heard about this
crazy.
situation? Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy, but this, you have to look at this in a context of a couple years. This is an opportunity that they cannot give up. Cheap oil is available, very cheap oil, discounts of 10, $20 and more a barrel, from already low values. So India just cannot pass up the opportunity to buy up as much oil as possible. It has a great uh, uh, refining capacity. So that is its opportunity to refine products and sell those, diesel and everything else. But that won't probably last too long because eventually Russia will redirect some of its oil. Maybe even the discounts might eventually be reduced despite sanctions, depending on the outcome of the war. If there is a resolution, and we've discussed this, I don't think a resolution is imminent, but in 5 years we could see something happen. And if that happens, even if Russia stays, on the sidelines of the world economy, its oil and gas industry will continue to pour oil out, and maybe the situation will normalize a little bit. And then India and China won't be able to buy bargain oil as it is now, maybe from other countries, maybe from Iran or from wherever else might be a problem. But this is an opportunity for the countries, and it's a window of opportunity. So this is a credit. Yes, they are bottom pickers. They will pick the most inexpensive barrels in the world, even if they have problems, and buy those for domestic and for re-export of products.
Sure,
Yes,
sure.
that is why the consideration of oil reserves and production, it's not very meaningful for both China and India because their resources, their reserves is not what's going to carry them. It's imports and alternative energies. So in both cases, they have to look for electricity matrix, for example, and it's growing. And the more it can grow, the more it can reduce their dependency on imported oil. Coal might still remain there. But these installed capacities, as big as they are, obviously India has a much lower standard of energy consumption, electricity consumption per capita. But this installed capacity, when you recognize that it's mainly achieved with coal, also says something else. Both of these countries have extreme energy poverty, and this is defined as a portion of the population which is basically consuming so little energy that it's
Yeah.
consuming the most basic types of energy, wood, coal. In India, even animal dung burned inside homes. This energy poverty is translated into a very large demand increase that we will
Yeah.
see over the next few
Yeah.
years.
And there is another point because the production, oil production in India is very small compared to China, and both countries have 1.4 billion people. So
Yeah,
they probably need much more oil than China to import much more than China. So this dependence is very strong, very
yeah.
very
India
huge.
is basically some further, 10 years behind China in developing its economy and its per capita energy consumption. And then it will be not only oil, but electricity and everything else that will have to grow to reach, we're talking about a fifth of what China is. So it has a path of growth ahead that is very sharp growth. China has moderated its growth, as we all know. Even GDP and so on are beginning to turn down a little bit. Instead of increasing at 7-8% as we were used to seeing, now it's 4 or 5%, maybe 6 in some cases. So this is the difference between China and India. But the underlying situation is still that both have tremendous amount of energy poverty in their populations. Obviously, China has less, India much more. But this implies much different path ahead because India, as its energy poverty demands are beginning to be addressed, it will have to increase oil imports tremendously. Oil consumption will go up, even other energies. And as I indicate here, renewables are not a big portion of overall resources in energy. They seem much bigger than they are because they account for significant hydroelectric power, which will not be able to be increased much in the future. So that percentage is going to go down, actually. In China, maybe it can go up because of solar and wind, but that percentage cannot grow very much based on hydro. It has been a big part is wood and other biomass being burned, and that is obviously not in the interest of those countries to be stimulated. They would prefer to be able to burn cleaner gas and so on when financial resources allow that to substitute those very basic energy consumptions. And I also show biofuels because biofuels is ethanol and biodiesel in both countries. Biodiesel is not a significant thing. Um, in China, for example, there is very little ethanol being mixed in gasoline because it has to be imported. So it's not a priority. India, likewise, has big sugarcane production, produces a lot of ethanol, but it doesn't blend much because it doesn't want that competition with sugar and ethanol to compete with sugar in the sugarcane industry. So biofuels are going to be a big challenge for both. And it's unfortunate because biofuels is exactly the kind of alternative energy that can go right directly, for example, into automotive demand because it's liquid fuels. And the fact that biofuels will be very constrained is a major uh, limitation on both of those countries. They recognize this. China and
and and
India understand their problems, their
and,
limitations.
and, it's- and it's interesting because biofuels is good for countries like Brazil and countries in Africa, of course, and India and China could have some more
No,
biofuels,
China
of
can't.
course.
It just doesn't have the growing capacity to do anything else than grow its own food. And it just doesn't have the spare capacity to grow sugarcane or corn or anything else that could produce ethanol in great quantities to use as biofuels. Unfortunately for them, that's a limitation. That's why it's the biggest
Okay.
agro importer. India, on the other hand, despite its big population, does have a better uh, potential for growing biofuels. In fact, if it were to convert some land that is still not efficiently being used, it could increase its biofuel capacity. And I point out that it's a prime candidate to try to uh, emulate Brazil's success story with biofuels. Over 50% of automobile consumption is ethanol in Brazil. If
Uh-huh.
that were to be the case in India, whether with E10 or E20 or just pure ethanol as in Brazil, they could go a great distance to increasing biofuels. But there again, the limitation is going to be agricultural land available. Their resources are available, but not so bountiful. And the challenges are always, climate related, monsoon related,
Mhm.
geographically related as to where are those areas in India, for example. China doesn't have much alternatives. So those constraints, they know this. This chart here, China and India, are very upset about this because this is limitations on what their energy resource uh, can do in the future, unfortunately. And this is also a reason, for example, I point this out. Look at this. This is the international um, destination of Chinese investments, and these black areas are oil and gas. And you can see that China has made heavy investments overseas, including in Brazil and elsewhere, because they recognize that they cannot grow their oil production very much. They will continue to be dependent on oil and gas for a long time. So the best they can do is try to diversify their sources. And by investing in overseas oil and gas investments, they can maybe advance their energy security by diversifying their sources. This for them is a very important avenue. I don't have a similar graph for China, for India, but India has done so also. As you know, India has invested in Brazilian oil and gas. India has investments in Africa. And to a lesser extent, it is also trying to do the same thing, to diversify its sources internationally so that it can complement its very low production in relation to its consumption. So that can try to improve its energy security in the sense that it has a different distributed sources, but its import dependency will continue to be big and probably even continue to
Yeah.
increase. It will be worse in the future.
Mhm. Mhm. You have some
Um,
more slides.
yeah, I think at this point it's
Okay.
well,
Let me. Okay, it's up to you, but I have a point for you because the U.S. is moving the supply chain for artificial intelligence for chips from China to India. It's betting that India will take control of this process, outsourced process
yeah,
from the U.S. My point is the following. So this is a leverage for India to grow and to
yeah.
increase capacity.
This, given those restrictions that I pointed out, what is left? What's left is uh, photovoltaic development and wind. And in those cases, China, of course, like I said, is 10 years ahead of India. But India is following in those footsteps. India is also trying to develop photovoltaic capacity. It is also building large plants. It is also building wind capacity. It is also installing wind capacity. So it's just basically following the what China did, and it has a great potential to do that. As you know, India has an English-speaking population that that has great engineering capability and potential, which is being already used in the West and being outsourced by countries. So it has that great potential, and that is the avenue that they have going forward because their alternatives are limited. So China will continue to place its bets on solar, and it's doing so at a great speed. And India is doing so as well, just in a different scale because it's 5 to 10 years behind. But this is their path to growth. It is not biofuels, it's not oil and gas. And if you say nuclear, yes, but nuclear is a slow growth. It's not something that you can leverage in 5 years, like you could in many of these other energies. But sure, both China and India are looking at
Yeah.
nuclear as well.
Let me bring another point to your analysis. Both countries are part of BRICS association,
Yes.
and at the same time, India, sometimes for me, from my perspective, seems like friend and enemy at the same time. You do not know the side that India is. Sometimes it's friend of China, sometimes of Russia, and sometimes from the US. So I do not know how
I
Americans
don't
are
think
thinking
anybody
about that.
does.
Anybody else. But how do you see the geopolitics situation in terms of this W's position?
Yeah. I think this plays into something interesting. In most countries, when you develop an energy policy, you look at energy security, or you look at decarbonizing, or you look at developing energy sources that might leverage some local development and so on. I think in both of these cases, China in particular, and I'll talk about it, China in particular is developing its energy policy based on geopolitical goals, objectives, not necessarily on anything else. It's not really too concerned about, climate change or decarbonizing. It's investing in wind and solar because that's where its capacity increase can come from, not because it's focused on green development. And the same is true for India. It's not looking at anything but cheap energy development. That's why it's still betting on coal. And both countries are looking at this from BRICS point of view. They seek greater BRICS interaction. They seek greater distancing from U.S. dominance in
The
trade
West,
with the
the
U.S.
West.
dollar. And they both seek independence, not energy independence, but independence from Western or U.S. dominance in the energy scenario. So this
Mhm.
drives both of those countries to relationships with Brazil, with Africa, with Southeast Asia, where they can develop and grow energy sourcing without being tied to U.S.
Yeah,
and Western interests. And this is an overriding concern for them, and it's expressed in their overseas
yeah, very
investments.
good point. Very
Um,
good point. Mm,
there's
sorry.
one more thing. When we speak about nuclear, and China is a relatively large nuclear powerhouse, 400 some units, it can grow them, and it will continue to grow them. India is determined to do that. But you see, those are expensive investments. So the urgency in those countries is to develop more energy quickly and cheaply. That's why in India's case, it's mostly coal. Yes, it's doing wind and solar because that's the second cheapest, but wind and solar are the cheapest, fastest way to add. India has an even more urgent problem because its population is growing fast. Its GDP per capita is very low. So as it's in the next 5 or 10 years, it will grow much more than China, which is close to stabilizing in population and probably further down the line also slowing its GDP growth. So those imperatives are very strong. And while the BRICS are the major attraction, they have to consider where they're sourcing their energy from. And it matters that it happens to be from BRICS, which is Brazil, African countries, and so on.
Your comment brings to me a thought that do you see that these two countries, are committed to the energy transition? I mean, to the net zero target for 2050?
Well, if I say no, they will say, of course we're. No, they're not committed to energy transition. They're committed to making energy available to their populations so that they will reduce their
Poverty
energy
issues.
gap and their energy poverty. That's it. It just so happens that the more solar and wind they put up, they can say, "Hey, look, we're putting up renewable energy sources." Yeah, it's a coincidence. It's
So,
not
so,
by
so
design.
two, 2.8 billion people are not committed to
No.
the energy transition. So who
Plus
who
some
are
more in the
committed?
world. Yeah,
Yeah, who are committed to these
yeah.
targets?
Yeah, this is the thing. You know, as you know, I consider myself an environmentalist, but you also have to be realistic. The energy transition is appealing to first world countries, developed countries that can make a difference in their economies. These China and India and a lot of the third world developing countries in South America, in
So
Africa, in Southeast
economics
Asia,
first.
they cannot afford to use that as a goal, a country goal. They can say that they would like to do that, but realistically, they cannot afford to do that.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, right?
unfortunately.
No, but
Okay.
but look at this. If you look at the capacity that China has to process chips and to uh, promote development of green energy elsewhere, you can say that China is doing its part by exporting a
Yeah,
tremendous amount of green
solar
energy
panels.
potential.
Yeah,
So, whether they want that as a country objective or not, they are doing something because they're exporting wind energy
solar
components. They're
panel,
exporting,
batteries, and so on.
yeah, materials that are used in wind
Both
turbines and
solar
so
and
on.
wind.
Yeah, so they're doing their part, whether they want to or not, because this is their export growth potential.
Yeah,
And even from a geopolitical standpoint, yes, they're dominant and they could flex their muscle, but would they want to turn off the faucet of tremendous exports? No, they're not likely
very
to
good
do
point.
that. They will continue to export those, even rare earths that are necessary for wind energy elsewhere in the world. They will continue to do that. So in the sense that an energy trend for China and even for India as it enters that same growth curve is that they will be advancing elsewhere.
And also exporting BYD cars, EVs. So it's
Yes,
very
I,
important to them.
I point that out that Chinese energy policy they say is focused on three uh, points. It's wind, solar, and EVs because they reduce uh, fuel consumption that would have to be imported. And if they have a tremendous electric vehicle fleet and it's handled by electricity produced in the country, they're
This is a
just
good point.
better
This
off.
is a good point. So electricity is not a problem for both countries. They have enough.
Right. I think they see that electrification is a much more realistic potential for them than it is for Western Europe, which they said they wanted to do, and they got into trouble, and they've had
Yeah,
to put coal back, and gas
yeah,
is in short supply.
yeah.
It just shows that the way the underlying energy mix is set up determines how you develop these things. So there is no question that India will eventually turn to electric cars also, because it will be able to develop great solar potential in electricity. And the more it can supply its automobile industry with electric vehicles, it will demand less imported fuel. So that's important for the country as well.
Going to the conclusions, I know that you have a last line
Yeah,
for me.
I just wanted to, let me see here. Yeah. Um, this, obviously a little bit negative, but China and India will remain oil and gas poor. No giant prospects for them. They will remain heavily dependent on coal, and that will be fine for the future, and imports of energy, oil and gas. China and India will continue to lead wind and solar because of what we spoke. This is, for them, a natural way to increase their energy security and independence. But China will be challenged to develop biofuels. Of course, it would like to do so, but it can't do so domestically, and that will be a big problem for them. India has a chance to copy some of Brazil's success, so we'll see how successful they are. They have a big problem with energy policy. It's not realistic, it's not coherent, and it has a lot of uh, uh, uncertainty built into the energy policy. So the whether they develop their biofuels potential is more dependent on politics and consistent policies than on actual land availability. Um, and I think that China and India will be severely challenged by the strong energy demand that they will face going forward. Because even though China's population is not growing, it's developing, and per capita consumption will continue to grow a lot. India's case is just much worse. Its population is growing, and it's growing from a much lower economic development point. So its energy consumption will grow exponentially, very fast, and that will spell, a big challenge to keep up with energy demand, mostly by imports, no matter how hard they try to develop alternatives. And as we said, both countries will develop energy policies according to their geopolitical interests, mainly staying at a distance from U.S. and Western interests, dealing more and more with BRICS among them, uh, trying to develop a good portion of their energy trade that is not in dollar terms, and that will probably grow in the next few years. It won't challenge the dollar supremacy, but that could grow significantly. And because of that, both India and China will continue to, as you say, be very difficult to categorize on which side are they on, because their interests are basically national interests, and they're not so concerned about whether Russia or China or the U.S. or
That's right.
Western Europe has a concern with Israel or anything else. They're concerned about their domestic energy needs. Their population has to be supplied, and they have to continue to let their growth grow without those limitations. That is what will determine
Yeah.
their energy policy.
I have a last point for you. May we remove this?
Yeah,
The last point is the following. You made me change my mind because uh, so in your opinion, Brazil took the right decision to support BRICS, India, China,
yes,
instead of West associations because the similarities that we have
yeah.
with them. Is it correct?
Yeah, it's in its interest. We went through this a while back, and it's a very coherent interest. Maybe there is political noise going on nowadays because of, gaffes and so on. But from a policy standpoint, it's a coherent policy. It was in the G20 presidency. It's promoting BRICS. The president of the BRICS Bank is Brazilian. This is all coherent policy advancing interests of Brazil. And China and India are aligned with that. Eventually, China will assume presidency. India will assume
Russia.
presidency also, and it will likewise continue to try to develop those BRICS relationships.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Cleveland Jones. Again, another podcast with you. Always learning with your thoughts.
No, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and it's always good to talk about geopolitical aspects that really affect the rest of the world, even though we spoke about the two largest populations in the world.
Perfect. Please stay online. We have some more details to talk.